Hello everyone, welcome to Keeney and welcome to part 3 of me ranking studio albums by former Beatles. And last time around we got all the way up to number 20. This time of course we're going to start with number 19 and it's an album from John Lennon and it's called Mind Games. It's from 1973. It got to my number 19 but it got to number 13 in the UK and it got to number 9 over in America in the charts. So it did fairly well considering this album followed up from Sometime in New York City, which, if you've seen my earlier videos in the series, you'll know that it's my least favourite John Lennon album. It's my least favourite, solo Beatles album. At least at this point in time, it is, and it's also one of my least favorite albums, kind of just generally. I wouldn't say it's the worst album ever made or anything like that, but it's definitely one of my least favorite albums, just sort of generally, all things considered. So yeah, this album came out a year later, there or thereabouts, and it's a much better step in the right direction. Not a great album, it's nothing remarkable, nothing up to. By the way, I just want to point out I am wearing a Batman t-shirt, but yeah, it's definitely a step in the right direction. Nothing spectacular, nothing up there with the best of the best or anything, but it's kind of really it's almost like a damage limitation sort of after you know, sometime in New York City, the catastrophe that was that kind of, at least I feel like it was a bit of a catastrophe. And I guess it reassured people when this album started up, and it's kind of a bit of a step in the right direction, at the very least. The album cover, I believe this was designed by John himself, has this kind of Monty Python-esque sort of feel to it. Almost expect to see, a statue of Queen Victoria sort of fall from the sky and land on John's head, sort of Terry Gilliam-esque sort of feel to it that it has. But anyway, the album opens up with the title track "Mind Games," and I believe that is the song that inspired uh, John to gave him the catalyst really to go out and put this album together. It was the push that he needed to kind of get this going. Apparently, he's very enthusiastic about it, which it's easy to tell why, because it is a pretty good John. It's a pretty good song from John. One of his better songs, just sort of generally, that came out after the breakup of the Beatles. So yeah, one of the things about this album that people say is that John had a lot of enthusiasm for that song, and he was very happy with it and everything. And then when it comes to the rest of the material on this album, he kind of just maybe didn't have the same level of sort of inspiration, so shall we say, and it kind of just isn't quite as strong, really. And the rest of this album is kind of quite middle of the road. It's probably one of John's most middle of the road albums, along with some of the material that you find on Double Fantasy. Although I do really like the song Tight Ass, which is the second track on the album, which I think is noteworthy. And there's other bits and pieces on here. It's nothing really awful, but it's nothing really nothing really awful, nothing really all that great about it either. It's kind of just a decent album to pick up if you're collecting all the John Lennon albums, like I am, for instance, for this. But it's kind of nothing really more than that, quite honestly. It's nothing to get overly excited about. I believe there is like a super deluxe version of this currently doing the rounds. It has been out for a little while now, with all I believe one of the gimmicks they included with that is in the book and things like that. There's like uh, is it ultraviolet light, sensitive messages and things like that you need a special light to activate and that kind of thing, which is kind of interesting. Probably more interesting this album kind of deserves. It's kind of just fine. It's just a fine, step in the right direction for for John after the the very disappointing really sometime New York City. It's got there the end of side one. It's got the utopian national anthem, which is a couple of seconds of silence, which is just the run out. John. It's just the run out of the album, which is just every album has that. But yeah, it's perfectly fine. Give it a shot, but don't expect anything brilliant about it. So we'll move on to number 18, and we'll move into a much more recent album, 2002's Brainwash from George Harrison. There's going to be quite a few actual George Harrison albums in this segment of noticed, but yeah, we'll start with this one. This is Brainwashed. Got to number 29 in the UK, and it got to number 18 over in America. It didn't do as amazing, really, because those charts are somewhat kind of a little bit maybe disappointing because this was released shortly after the death of George. Unfortunately, I believe they tried to get out before. He was obviously he was quite ill before he died. Tried to get this out before he passed. I don't think it would. They kind of made it, unfortunately. But yeah, this has kind of. I've always felt like this has an almost homemade feel to it. I feel like George, towards the end of his life, the fact that he there's this is his final album really. But before this, it was 1987's Cloud Nine, which I'm going to get to soon enough. But so he kind of went over a decade without. Obviously, had the Traveling Wilburys and that kind of thing, but that didn't make its way that far into the 90s and that kind of thing. So yeah, he kind of definitely. He wasn't focused on putting albums out and material out. He was kind of, I feel like the material in this is stuff that he kind of really wanted to record mainly for himself, and if anyone else kind of liked it, then so be it. Sort of kind of mentality to it, and I kind of like that aspect about it very much. It's kind of got this quite personal feel to it. Opens with Any Road, which I've noted down as one of the better songs on the album. Also, there's an instrumental on here which is really, really nice, well worth a listen. Never heard it before, or just give her another listen if you haven't listened to it in some time. It's called Marwood Blues. It's really, really nice, really beautiful piece of music. And yeah, it's all very solid stuff. There's a final song on here, Brainwash, the title track. Typical sort of George Harrison sort of satire on life and things. And it's good. It's a good solid George Harrison album, but it's nothing that really will convert anyone who maybe just isn't really that into George or anything like that. It's just I feel like this is something more for the fans. This is a very fan focused album. People who love George, this is well worth a listen and well worth looking into. Odd as well, very odd artwork on this one. The crash test dummies. I've never really felt like this was kind of really appropriate for a George Harrison album cover, artwork's choice. I just feel like this is something you'd find on like a techno album almost, or something like that. George had the cover of this definitely probably the oddest solo Beatles album cover that there is. I can't think of an odder one quite honestly, and yeah, definitely an odd choice for George Harrison. I see that and I don't really think George Harrison in his later years, quite honestly. But anyway, yeah, it's a decent album all told. But it's nothing. Uh, it's not up there with his best material, unfortunately. But it's got this nice little personal, homemade kind of feel. It's almost like George inviting you around and making you a cake almost. But it's got odd packaging to go with it. So it's a bit of a bit of a mishmash. But overall, pretty good. We'll move on to another George album. I've mentioned it before. This is Cloud Nine from 1987. My number 17. It got to the UK chart position of 10, and it got to 8 in the US. So yeah, one of his bigger hits for George. A good chart hit. And really his last sort of attempt at, besides the Traveling Wilburys that come later, but as a solo artist, this is his last real kind of push for the spotlight. Really, you feel. He's kind of for the first time he's got some interest in kind of selling some records and that kind of thing. Being a rock star instead of gardening and that kind of thing, and you know race cars and all the other things. He was interested in making films and all that. So he's actually focused on being a rock star for a moment in time. I think a lot of credit really goes to Jeff Lynne for this album. He produced it with George, and I think Jeff put a lot of the energy that this album has, much needed energy as well. I feel like even some of George's better albums, I feel like they lack. They never get out. Without having a car metaphor, they never really get out of like third gear, at best really second gear. Some of them, I feel like with Jeff, he kind of pushes George to kind of, you know, reach a little bit further and dig a little bit deeper. And this is a fine, late, this was the final album that George put out in his lifetime, and it's a nice one to kind of go out on, really, and his real last push for superstardom. Before he kind of went back in his garden and kind of gave up and became a bit of a hermit again, which is a lifestyle we can all kind of dream of, really. So yeah, it's a nice album. I love very much like the production. Of course, it is quite 80s and that kind of thing. It came out in '87, but I think it holds up fairly well. My favourite song on here is called "Just for Tonight," which is this really beautiful kind of ballad. It kind of hits you out of it kind of just pops in halfway through or towards the end of side one, should I say, and it's just really, really nice. And there's other good bits and pieces here, here and there. Nothing overly remarkable or anything like that, but definitely, after some of the lesser albums that George put out, particularly in the '80s, his '80s output isn't very good. This is definitely the jewel, really, of George Harrison's solo '80s output, definitely. And it's definitely, if you're going to pick an album up from George from the 1980s, Cloud Nine's definitely the way to go. So anyway, we'll move on to again another George Harrison album. This is called George Harrison from 1979, self-titled album. Got number 39 in the UK, so not great, hit in the UK. Number 14 in America, so yeah, did better in the States and did here, almost in the top 10 for America. I think that's probably yeah. I don't think he was necessarily upset about that. Those albums were doing better in America than in the UK. Considering the amount of money you make from a hit record in America compared to the UK, it's kind of like 10 times, 100 times bigger. So yeah, he was definitely making hits in the right part of the world anyway. But anyway, this is a perfectly good, you know, uh, George Harrison album. It's perfectly fine. One of the things that's a bit curious about it is it a little bit Beatles-esque. There's a few hints here of Beatles to this, which you didn't often get really with solo stuff. And it's surprising that it came really from George, quite honestly. You get the song "Not Guilty," which has always been a bit of a head scratcher for me. Why this? I genuinely don't know. Anyone in the comments maybe knows more about this than I do. But I've often wondered why it took so long for George to record that song and put it out on one of his albums. It came out in 1979. I believe that, Not Guilty was written it was apparently it was put forward for the White Album. So that's from '68. So it took almost over a decade or so for it to find its way, on the George Harrison album. I'm curious as to why that's the case. Why wasn't it on sometime New York, sometime New York. All Things Must Pass. Well, why wasn't it on their album? I think that would have been perfect for it, really. When you think that their album was really George's kind of, it was his kind of way of, you know, uh, highlighting his freedom, really, from outside of the Beatles. He can finally put these songs out that the other Beatles went happy on putting on a Beatles album. You can finally do that with something like All Things Must Pass and that kind of thing. But it just never made its way onto their album. It never made its way on on any album until this. 1979. It took a long while for it to happen. It's not a great song. I'm kind of I'm not too sure whether it would have been great on the White Album. The album, of course, is quite patchy at best anyway, which is what I kind of like about it. I love about it, really. But it's perfectly fine. I don't really know how I feel about it being on or not being on. It's kind of anything goes really with our album. So I wouldn't necessarily hate it being on there, but I don't think it's necessarily a big loss at the same time either. It's also got a song that follows Not Guilty called "Here Comes the Moon," which of course has comparisons in terms of the title at the very least to "Here Comes the Sun." George is arguably one of, if not his most famous song. And yeah, again, another Beatles connection. There's all kind of theories, I guess, circulating around that George was thinking about the Beatles and that kind of thing. Reforming and and all that kind of stuff. Who knows? Who knows for sure? Or it's an interesting theory anyway. And yeah, everything else on here is perfectly fine. There's a song on here, "Faster," which is George's love letter to racing cars and all that kind of stuff, which he was very much into at this time. My favourite song on here, though, is the song Soft Hearted Hannah, which is a song that nobody ever mentions, but it's really, really nice. It's a really nice, ramshackled, you know, it's almost like it was recorded in a bar, but it's just really fun, you know, nice song. I really do quite like it. It's got this very sort of almost barnyard feel to it, and it's got a lot of charm to it, and it's just a song that nobody really mentions, so I kind of have a little bit of a soft spot for it. But yeah, very decent, very perfectly fine, but nothing really all that remarkable about George Harrison's solo or self-titled album, should I say. So I'll move on to another George. It's almost like George Harrison's discography I'm going through here. So yeah, this is just how it worked out. So it's number 15, 33 and a thirds, 1976. This album, so many numbers. It's my number 15. It came out in 1976, and the album's called 33 and a third. I've got some more numbers for you here. In the UK, it got to number 35, and in the US, it got to number 11. So, yeah, as I was talking about with the previous album, the self-titled George Harrison album, this is kind of more of the same, but I feel like this album has a bit more of the edge. One of the things with this album is, well, the main thing with it really is that when it's playing, when I'm listening to this record, I think, yeah, this is really quite a good album. This is really, and it's a good, really good, solid George Harrison album. But when it's after it's finished spinning on the turntable, it kind of just, it kind of just disappears almost from memory. It just becomes, there's just something about it really. It just kind of comes and goes. It's like a pretty good but not great sort of action film. You watch it and you enjoy it, and then it finishes, and then the next day you kind of not really remembering all too much about it. Maybe it's my brain that just can't just can't remember things. Probably the case. But yeah, it's just it doesn't really resonate, this album, or it is while it's playing. Very, very nice. It's a very good. The production on this is really nice. The instrumentation, the musicians that George has got, really great, really well put together, and it's got some nice songs on it as well. It's got Crackerbox Palace, which is a nice little song. It's got the final track on here, Learning How to Love You, is really, really nice. And that's actually my favourite song on this album. Just this really, really nice, sweet, sort of romantic, overly romantic, really nice love song, really. And you got a song of the Pure Smoky, which is nice. You got a cover of True Love. So it's just a really nice, polished, well put together, if kind of very forgettable album. Something that's definitely worth picking up if you're into George. These kind of things. Solo albums and the Beatles and that. But it's nothing you really want to run out and kind of get. A lot of these albums we're featuring in this segment in particular, they kind of fall into this category of kind of catch if you can. That's what this and all the other albums are kind of like. They're very much, yeah, they're perfectly fine. If you're in a record shop and you're record hunting, or you're just looking for something to CDs or whatever it is you're into, and you see any of these albums and they're going cheap and they're in nice condition, you can't find anything else you want. That's how I got these albums, by the way. That's exactly how I picked them up. I'd be in a record shop looking for things, I wouldn't find them because you never know what you're gonna get in. To quote Forrest Gump, you never know what you're gonna get, and I didn't find what I was looking for, so I'd look through the Beatles section and I'd see stuff like this, and I think, what the hell, I'll pick her up. And that happens several times, and you end up with a big back catalogue of all their records and that kind of thing. And for that, it's perfectly fine. But they're nothing to get overly excited about, these albums. We'll leave them for the fourth and final segment. But before we wrap things up, one last one. Got to number 14. So of course, next time around we'll start with 13. Good old lucky 13. What can possibly go wrong? And this is 1979's Back to the Egg from Wings. Got to number 6 in the UK, number 8 over in America. And this is the final Wings album to be released. And yeah, they went out on a decent note really with this. Did quite well in the charts. And I guess Paul was probably thinking, should I stay or should I leave at this point? Should I keep them going? Should I keep Wings going? Must have been tempting to just think, yeah, we'll keep going just a bit longer. The albums are still selling well. They could kind of tour and sell out any arena in the world. Of course, at this point, that's been the case for a long time. So it must have been tempting to just kind of keep going. And I think it definitely showed a little bit of balls really from Paul to kind of break the band up at this point. I guess he felt like it gone as far as it could kind of go maybe, but obviously the temptation was there to maybe keep it going and see how if it could keep going even longer. Maybe reshuffle the group and maybe get some maybe form a super group perhaps in the new decade. Just from the tail end of the 70s. There was all these probably things going around his head, and in the end, he just decided to go solo, which is ultimately fair enough. And yeah, the Wings kind of bowed out on a strong album. I don't think Wings ever put out a bad album. I think all of them are at least pretty decent. And this is definitely a solid release, although it's nothing overly brilliant as I've been talking about. These are not the best of the best, but they're perfectly good albums. Now, one of the things about this is it was kind of, I believe, Paul's kind of answer to punk. Punk was kind of, I guess it was coming to somewhat of an end. It kind of exploded and was imploded at this point in 1979. Uh, so it has this kind of a bit more of a harder edge. It's definitely not punk music. This though, it's very very far from punk music. If anything, it's a little bit more towards prog rock than it is punk rock. Particularly the album cover. The album cover is very sort of is very prog rock. You could almost take Wings out of this and put a Yes in it, perhaps, or something like that, or King Crimson or whatever, and you got yourself a very proggy album. Although I haven't said all of that, it's not a prog album either, but it's closer to prog than it is to punk, really. And just looking at the liner notes here, one of the tracks on here is it Rockestra has actually David Gilmour on there. So yeah, you've got from there alone, you've got a prog rock kind of royalty, you know, involved in that. You've got John Paul Jones on there and Pete Townsend and all that kind of thing. But yeah, it's definitely leans more towards prog this one than anything else. But at the end of the day, it's just a slightly harder uh, Wings album, which isn't really saying a great deal. Wings aren't exactly a hard rocking band. The almost like the ultimate kind of soft, so 70s soft rock group to a certain extent. But there's good stuff on here, and there's definitely some things on here. Something like spin it on, and that kind of thing. It's got a bit more of a rocking edge to it. But then again, it ends with a Baby's Request, which kind of goes back into the soft rock, to an extreme degree. So yeah, my favourite song on here is actually Old Siam Sir, which is a great, fun, typical sort of, it's almost Wings, last hurrah of Wings, really. It wouldn't be out of place on some of Wings, higher up albums, kind of be a good like single for, something from Band on the Run and that kind of thing. The singles from that. It's kind of good, but not quite there really. And it's got some really good stuff on it. It's got some odd stuff on it. There's the bit the message is it that's the broadcast. Sorry, which is just spoken word section, which is kind of really sure what they were thinking with that one, but it's perfectly fine. It's a little bit different. It's got a little bit of a rockier edge. It's got some nice ballads on it, but ultimately, it's kind of like stuff we've already really covered. I feel like Paul's kind of covered all this material to a certain extent at this point, and maybe he felt like it kind of Wings had kind of run its course here. And with this doing quite well, maybe he thought maybe better, like the Beatles ended on while they were still very popular. Maybe it was better to end Wings when they were still doing quite well and they were still selling records and that kind of thing, rather than waiting for them to maybe dip in popularity, to maybe an even greater extent. But anyway, all that's ancient history now, and yeah, this is the final Wings album, and it's pretty good. Again, it's another album that, it's an album that I picked up because I went to a record shop one day and I couldn't find what I was looking for. So I looked through the Paul McCartney section, the Wings section, and I found that. I thought, what the hell, I'll pick her up. It was cheap, and I've had her ever since. Fairly early. I remember picked her up donkeys years ago. I've had it for number of years now, probably close to a decade, and yeah, it's a nice same copy. I'm very happy with it, and this is how you want to collect these albums. These are very much you know in the sort of reserve. You've got these are reserve albums when you can't find what you're after when you're out and about record hunting. So yeah, that'll do for this segment. Next time around, of course, will be part four, be the fourth and final section, and we'll finally finish this saga, and we'll know where we stand really. Well, you'll know where I stand on all these many solo Beatles albums, and I better get it wrapped up and get it finished before Paul McCartney releases another album, because I've got a feeling he will put something out. He's going on tour again. I believe he's touring the UK around Christmas time. I, I was thinking about picking tickets up, and then I forgot all about it, and then they sold out. Apparently, they sold out in 4 seconds and that kind of thing. You know what it's like these days. Well, it's always been the case, actually. Tickets just go. You got to be kind of, it's luck. It's a luck game, and if you're not lucky, you don't get them. But I've seen Paul perform, live, so I don't really feel too disappointed that I'm not going to be seeing him. I believe I was going to try and get tickets in Manchester, and it just wasn't to be. But these things happen anyway. So anyway, enough of me rabbiting on about my misfortunes and acquiring Paul McCartney tickets. I'll see you next time with part four, the fourth and final section. Then we'll start making videos about other things. I might make a video actually the next time around about something that unrelated. Have a bit of a break from solo Beatles talk and that kind of thing. Make a video about something else. Whatever. I'm not too sure whether I'll do that, but we'll keep going. We'll keep going, pressing forward. Now we'll make, of course, eventually that fourth and final section for numbers 14 or 13, actually, should I say? Lucky 13, all the way up to number one. So I'll see you then. Bye bye.